Hello, welcome back to Transmedia Storytelling from Mythology to Marvel. This is Lecture 4, World as Main Character. So, when we're talking about building big transmedia ready story worlds, the emphasis here is on worlds, right? Um, you can tell a single transmedia story. A single transmedia story, as we talked about in previous lectures, might begin in a single medium, like animation, then go on to a second medium, like a movie, and into a third medium, like a video game. But really, when you're starting to develop something that is hopefully going to have the same kind of cultural impact as something like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or Star Wars, or Star Trek, these are worlds. These are worlds that support multiple stories. Therefore, the most important character in a vast transmedia story world is the world itself, right? You need to be able to design a world that can support multiple stories, multiple casts of characters moving through that world. But you also can't just design a world that is a beautifully designed world, but is cold and sterile. You need human, or well, you need some kind of characters, human or not, that are going to move through that world and serve as a lens into that world for your audiences. So, I was an English major when I was an undergrad, which means I am contractually obligated to use Aristotle in all of my lectures. So if you go back and you look at the Poetics, right? Um, Aristotle argues that the most important thing in a story is the plot. I can tell you the story of France and Germany going to war and never get down to the level of, the actual soldiers on the battlefield. I never actually have to introduce you to generals or lieutenants by name. The abstract nations of France and Germany are sufficiently interesting on their own so that if I start telling the story about how they go to war, you're going to want to know who won and how, right? Um, so at its most basic, plot über alles, right? Plot over everything. However, we are human beings, and as human beings, we like stories about other human beings or things that we recognize to have characteristics as human beings, as evidenced by things like Toy Story, My Little Pony, and whatnot, Transformers, giant robots. So we're really interested in characters. We might be sufficiently interested in the abstract notions of France and Germany, but once we do start telling those stories about individual characters, that's where we as humans, really start perking up our ears and we want to know more. So stories like about characters like the Red Baron, in World War II. Like, we want to know, like, what's the history of that character. So going back to ancient Greece, you could see the mythologies of those eras. Characters like Hercules, the multiple trials of Hercules, as arguably the first set of sequels in narrative history. But then what we start seeing is a shift beyond just a series of infinite sequels about a particular character. We become interested in big, vast story worlds, right? So, a universe like Star Trek can support the original series. It can support the animated spin-off of that series. It can support Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, all the feature films that can support everything going all the way up to the new shows like Discovery and Picard and Below Decks, because there is that big vast world, that all these things fit together in. And once you start looking at this notion of a meta story or the super story of how that world itself unfolds, even across multiple characters, that's where you start getting into some really interesting stuff from a narrative design perspective. The new season of Star Trek Discovery has the crew jumping 1,000 years in the future, and it tells the story of what happens, spoilers, after the United Federation of Planets has mysteriously disbanded. And there's this great mystery called the Great Burn about what happened that caused the downfall of the United Federation of Planets. And so if you start looking at all these different components of the Star Trek universe, you can start to observe that it's not the story of Kirk, it's not the story of Picard, it's not the story of Janeway, or any of these great captains, Cisco, right? It's really the sort of super story of the rise and fall and hopefully rise again of the United Federation of Planets, of that world in which Star Trek exists. And so if you start looking at this through the lens we talked about before, that central deviation from reality, you start to see the central deviation from reality of Star Trek is, what if there was a future in which Earth belonged to this thing called the United Federation of Planets, right? And people would look at that federation through different lenses. Some people view the Federation of Planets as this, great sympathetic peacemaking force. Others view the Federation of Planets as a kind of a conquering set of Inquisition type of characters, right? So again, look at that sort of central deviation from reality and say, are you telling a story about one character, or can you tell this big, vast story about multiple characters running around in an interesting world? So, again, once you start looking at things through this kind of a lens, then you can start to perceive this approach of narrative design as a set of rules, right? Saying what you can and cannot do within that story universe. So, this was very much the approach that we took at the World Building Media Lab, which, as I've discussed before, was the brainchild of Alex McDowell. And so what Alex was doing was using this approach to begin with a central deviation from reality and then building out from there into big, vast story worlds that could support this kind of multi-layered storytelling approach. So he began, and he got to this approach through production design. Right. So as I discussed before, production design is the design of the production itself. So if you're making a story, something like Batman Begins, or in Alex's case, Fight Club, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Man of Steel, all these kinds of movies, what would happen is the production designer would get a hold of the script, and then they would have to start asking questions about what that world would feel like, right? So what do the different shots look like? Not in the way that they're framed per se, but the set design, the costume design, the way that the cars exist in this world, character design. If if you're talking about something like Star Wars or Star Trek, creature design, right? So for something like Fight Club, if you go and you look at the house in which Fight Club is set, that big rickety house, it is very clearly a duplex, right? And that kind of collapsing, crumbling duplex is meant to be, spoilers, reflective of the mind of Edward Norton. In Man of Steel, there was this very clear design aesthetic that they adopted at the beginning that imagined that Krypton as this futuristic planet. Had this very much more symbiotic relationship with nature, right? I mean, it was very high tech, but that high technology had become so advanced that what's the word I'm looking for? To sort of muck around with Isaac Asimov, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. The corollary to that might be that at this day and age, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from nature. So that the guiding principle that Alex had for Man of Steel was there are no straight lines on Krypton. So if you look carefully at the logo for Man of Steel, the gentle lines there are curved. Even the lines in the shield that you normally think of as being straight lines still have that kind of curve to them, that more organic, sinuous line to them. Anyway, but Minority Report was really the movie where this approach hit the road, right? So in Minority Report, Steven Spielberg came to Alex and Spielberg, the story was based on, or the movie was based on a short story, and Spielberg liked the short story, but the short story wasn't really enough to carry a movie. And so the original script had been based directly on that short story, and Spielberg thought, this isn't quite working. So he brought on Alex and a new screenwriter on the same day. And he said to them, look, I want Minority Report to feel not so much like a sci-fi story as it is almost a documentary of the future. I want it to feel plausible. I want it to feel realistic. And I want you guys to go out and figure this out. And so Alex and the scriptwriter looked at each other and sat down and they're like, okay, well, if we're going to build a future that feels plausible, why don't we begin with this idea of a what if, right? Your central deviation from reality is that, in Minority Report, what if you could predict the future within a limited amount of time and a limited amount of space, right? And then what they did was they went out and they brought in these really brilliant people from all over multiple industries. So they recruited folks from the MIT Media Lab that were doing interesting experiments with user interface design. They recruited folks from Ford that were looking at the future of transportation. They brought in people from Washington, D.C., looking at the future of government and urban planning, things like that. And so, as this think tank sat down and started working through this kind of world architecture, then it became a question of, okay, what if, then what, then what, then what, then what, and then finally to this idea of so what, to get to the beating human heart at the core of that story, to use Pixarian terms. So, in Minority Report, it posits that there are these three precogs, right? Kind of like mutants that can predict the future as long as they're connected together in this kind of really weird sort of synthio bath thing, right? It's sci-fi. Don't think too hard about it. And so then, if you could predict the future within a limited amount of time and a limited amount of space, the United States government would almost inherently and obviously put that in Washington, D.C., so that nobody can attempt to or successfully assassinate the president or any other politicians. So what that means is that Washington, D.C. suddenly becomes a huge target for immigration, so to speak. Because if you have a city where you can't get murdered, and this, the cops are going to show up, this pre-crime unit that Tom Cruise is a part of, everybody's going to want to live there. So suddenly the population density of Washington, D.C. literally shoots through the ceiling. Now, in the real world, there is a law that says that you cannot build any taller than the Capitol building inside of Washington, D.C. proper. That's why D.C. has this incredibly low, flat skyline. But you can build as tall as you want to on the other side of the Potomac River. So what that means is that the skyline in Minority Report is still very low and flat around the city itself. But then as soon as you start getting over on the other side of the river, there's this explosion of super skyscrapers of people that are still living within the precognitive range of the precog. So the pre-crime unit will still show up and stop them. Somebody tries to kill you. But they're not in D.C. proper. So now we start to see, what if the central deviation from reality, then what is something as basic as housing, right? This is the impact that deviation from reality would have on basic living conditions, basic architecture, basic housing. Now, the problem with that is that in a super skyscraper, the kinds that you find in Dubai, for example, the biggest bottleneck becomes the elevators, right? If you have these big, vast buildings like this, it might take you longer to get from your apartment on the 45th floor of the building or whatever, down to the front door than it would take you to get from the front door to your office building somewhere else in the city. So one of the things that they were working on with the engineers from like Ford or the Media Lab was to say, okay, what is a future of transportation for a city that is suddenly much more vertical than it is horizontal? And so what they came up with this idea of these kind of maglev cars, right? So maglev is magnetic levitation. If you go over to Japan, for example, some of the bullet trains use this kind of maglev technology because by using magnets, they are able to levitate hence maglev, levitate the trains actually off the tracks so that it reduces friction. And if you have a system in which you don't have friction, right, it means you can go a lot faster. And by using different changes in the charges on the bottom of the vehicle with the ground beneath it, if the ground is set up for this, then it means that you can kind of fire these magnets in this kind of sequence that makes these things go faster and faster and faster and faster and faster. What that also means is that if you have a building that is made out of the same stuff, then you can suddenly start having these pods go rocketing along the ground to the base of the building, have turn the whole thing 90 degrees up on its back end, right? Make the magnets clamp the car onto the side of the building and literally drive up the side of the building. When it gets up to your apartment, basically a giant garage door opens up on the side of your apartment and the pod, slides in. In this particular world, the pod slides in and turns into a couch in your living room. Now, if you're Michael Bay, you get to this idea of, vertical car chase, and you're like, boom, mission accomplished. Steven Spielberg's a little more complicated than Um, so what Spielberg was mostly interested in is how can that sort of story world exist as a well, like all great sci-fi, exists not so much just about the future, but as a commentary on the present. And so for Spielberg, he was mostly interested in telling his story as a commentary on this emergent surveillance society, that we tend to have, especially in countries like England, where there's a closed circuit TV camera mounted on virtually every street corner and building in London. Um, and so the sort of panopticon that results, this civilization in which you are always under observation. Um, what Spielberg was wondering is, what is the illogical extreme of that? So if you're interested in becoming a storyteller, one of the great tricks you can put in your toolbox is to take any kind of future casting, any kind of very kind of odd current state of affairs situation, and run it out to its illogical extremes. And so for Spielberg, that was asking, would you really want to live in a society where, the future was predictable if you could be prosecuted for a crime that not only had you not yet committed, but that you had no intention of committing in the first place? So when Tom Cruise's character, the detective in the pre-crime unit, suddenly finds himself being prosecuted for killing a person that he'd never even heard of, that's where Cruise has to suddenly start, trying to bring down the whole system, as the system is itself obviously inherently flawed. And so the innocent people can be very clearly, prosecuted for something that they could not disprove that they clearly hadn't done, because the entire crux of the matter was to stop them from doing it in the first place. So anyway, so that's that sort of so what that comes at the end of that particular process, right? So what if predict the future? So what? New architecture. So what? New transportation. Or excuse me, then what? New architecture. Then what? New transportation. But the so what is the kind of societal commentary that exists out of that kind of a reflection. And that itself is very much the kind of overall theme that might emerge from that sort of a process. And once you start to identify those what if moments, those central themes to your story, then you can sort of start using that as a lens through which to determine what kinds of stories you're going to tell in this kind of a world. So, again, what if, then what, so what, right? Now, Alex uses this mandala model here as a way to think through this. And it's incredibly complicated, right? Just looking at this, it took me years of working with Alex to be able to kind of parse this particular diagram. But what he's reflecting in this, with the different kind of color structures and the different radiant patterns here, is that a lot of this stuff is very, very, very connected. So if you see the scale markers on the outside, you begin with this sort of individual scale, and then as you move out, you go from individual to family, community, city, and world, and so on and so forth. And the most important element of this is that human lens that's there at the center. I like a simpler model, right? So when I'm building my worlds, I run it up the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So just the same way that Minority Report asks, what if, then what? If you start at the base level of the hierarchy of needs and you say, okay, how does this basically transform how we live as animals? Right? So how do we get our food? How do we get our water? How do we find warmth when it's cold? Where do we sleep when we're tired? What kind of shelter do we need inside of that kind of a world? Moving up from there, then you start saying, okay, well then how does that central deviation from reality impact things like our basic security and safety? How does that affect our weapons? How does that affect our armor? How does that affect our armies, navies, and so on and so forth? Then you start getting into more areas of more complex societies, right? So that you have friendships, relationships. How do people relate to each other inside of that world? And how does that kind of existence, that deviation from reality, change those kinds of relationships? Moving up beyond that, then you start to look at the sort of structures that exist not within multiple groups of people, but in hierarchies within that society, right? So this idea of prestige and feeling of accomplishment. If you have a society that is based on a different set of moral values than ours is, right, then how does that impact what people think of each other? So it's not just what does it mean to be, human in that kind of society. The question is what does it mean to be a good human in that society? Or what does it mean for other people to afford respect within inside of that society? So if you are suddenly positing a future environment that climate change has made the entire world suddenly increase by a factor of like 100 degrees, right? And so, like, most places along the equator are now scorched deserts. Well, what does it mean to be a good person in that kind of existence? Who is it that gets elevated to become a tribal chief? Is it the refrigerator repairman? It might be, right? The person that provides air conditioning. I'm sure they would be very popular. But then beyond that, then you start getting into this question of self-actualization, right? So it's not just what does it mean to be, a good person in that world, but what does it mean to be the best version of yourself in that world, right? So then you start getting into questions of not just who is the tribal leader, right? But who should be the tribal leader? What does it mean to be a good tribal leader? What does it mean to be honorable and ethical? What does it mean to really be the best version of yourself that you can be with inside of that world, right? And some of that's going to deal with art, and music, and culture. That sort of thing is going to kind of exist all the way around the top of that kind of pyramid. But anyway, so that particular exercise I found in my work to be incredibly fruitful. And that's the kind of thing that I'm having you run your worlds through here too. If you observe that you posit, okay, so I have this future world in which cheese is blue, right? You're like, okay, cool. So, well, does housing change? Does food change other than the fact that the cheese you put on your grilled cheese sandwiches is blue? Does security change? Does safety change? I mean, it could. If you want to get really ridiculous, you certainly could. But honestly, what you're looking for is a deviation from reality that is sufficiently large to generate an entire world, right? If cheese being blue does not have any major impact on your world, then you probably need a different what if. If you find yourself saying, the world is exactly like ours except for this one little thing, well, you better figure out if that one little deviation from reality is going to be sufficient enough to drive an entire transmedia story world. Because if it's not, then you're not playing with the right scale yet. It's not to say that a story that only has some small deviation from reality can't be successful. What I'm saying is that it's not necessarily a story world. So James Bond, the Bond franchise, is incredibly popular, right? It has lasted for years and years and years and years and years and years and years. But the problem is that it is almost impossible to do a really good spin-off out of James Bond because Bond is the only really remarkable super spy in that world, right? If you ask, what does it mean to be a spy in the world of Bond? What does that mean, right? Is it to say, well, spies in the world of Bond drive Aston Martins with weird things coming out of their wheels and laser beams hidden behind the headlights? Well, that's not. I mean, that's cool, but it's not really enough of a central deviation from reality to make this exist at a whole scale, right? So what you might find is that you've told a really interesting story about one really interesting character. But when you try to branch out into other characters, it gets really, really hard. You start running out that same question in something like the Fast and the Furious universe, right? The Fast and the Furious universe is very much our own, but with a amplified degree of explosions and fast cars. Is it entirely possible to tell a story about a really fast Ford Datsun, whatever, or a Ford Charger, right? One of these like supercars, and have them be pulling off a heist. Better yet, if you tell a story with a whole bunch of supercharged minis, and they go out and they pull off a heist using these minis, is that a Fast and the Furious story, or is that the Italian Job, right? Once you start saying Well, this particular story could exist in any other story world, and it's not clear that this is its own thing. You haven't built a story world yet, right? You have to go look harder at that original set of deviation from reality rules to make your own world recognizably different, sufficiently differentiated from its closest competitors, like we talked about in the earlier lecture. Now, going back to Alex's mandala model, this is, like I said, this is beautiful. It's a beautiful model. It's incredibly complicated. It is very representative of the complex interconnections between all these different aspects of things that are frequently discussed when you're building story worlds. The problem is that it's so complicated until you start zooming in on that bit in the middle, right? The human lens at the center. The human lens is one way to explore that world, right? So if you're not sure whether your world is sufficiently differentiated from our own, then one great exercise is to start creating characters and running them through that world. Just running them through a day in the life of that world, right? Once you start imagining, like, okay, where do they wake up? How do they get their breakfast? What do they have for breakfast? Where do they go to work? How do they get there? Those kinds of mundane questions. Then you are able to establish an ordinary world, right? That is sufficiently differentiated from our own world that it still is powerful as a storytelling engine. And then once you get that deviation set up, then you can start doing the second deviation, which is the sort of call to action moment or the call to adventure moment at the beginning of your story, where your hero's story deviates from their own original ordinary world. And so we'll get back to that when we start talking about story structure pretty soon. Now, if you start realizing that you have multiple characters that all have different lifestyles inside of that world, then you start realizing that you've built something sufficiently robust that these different characters have different perspectives on that world. So in the world of Middle Earth, in Fellowship of the Ring or Lord of the Rings, you meet the hobbits, you meet the dwarves, you meet the world of men, you meet the elves and the sorcerers, right? These kinds of different characters have their own individual cultures that all exist within that world. The central deviation from reality of Lord of the Rings is not perfectly clear, right? That's one of the reasons why that world is sort of gained its own mythos through sheer force of its of its original creator. But the idea of what makes the world of Tolkien different from other high fantasy stories about elves and dwarves, it's not really clear. If there's a hobbit in it, it's probably in Lord of the Rings. It's probably in Middle Earth. But if there's an elf in it, could be Dragonlance, could be Dungeons and Dragons, could be Mists of Shannara, it could be a million other kinds of stories, right? So I would argue that Lord of the Rings is a brilliant story insofar as it shows different kinds of walks of life in that sort of world, but it is insufficiently differentiated from its closest competitors to really stand on its own as an individual, remarkable story world. So at the World Building Media Lab, what we as students and researchers would do is we would start with a central deviation from reality and then start imagining characters, right? So even during the world building process, we would, each of us would imagine our own characters set in that world, right? So in one class, we would say, okay, what is our central deviation from reality? And so for Dry City, we imagine the future of Lagos, Nigeria, in which drinkable water had been privatized. I think we touched on this before, but that idea of a big city with a booming movie business that is located next to a very large body of water, but that water is salt water, so it's not immediately drinkable, with a huge disparity between the haves and the have-nots. That is not a subtle metaphor for Los Angeles, right? And so in Lagos, Nigeria, there is this Lagos Lagoon in the center of the city, center of the city, Lagos Lagoon. And there's a whole bunch of homeless folks that have basically built these sort of floating shanties in the middle of the lagoon. And it's a fisherman's village, sort of. The problem is that much of the water that's in that lagoon is so incredibly toxic and polluted that fishing out of that water is disgusting and completely, shall we say, not recommended. So what we imagined was that in 100 years or whatever, when the story takes place, that culture had used repurposed technology in order to purify the drinking water beneath them, right? So that they could more easily get water to drink and food to eat by fishing out of the Lagos Lagoon through locally purified water. What that meant was that when drinkable water in the rest of the city had been privatized, that this particular culture suddenly became this sort of uh, these forerunners, this vanguard of new ecological technology. And the community feeling that grew out of that as they had collaboratively developed this technology and were collaboratively working together in order to survive off of this repurposed technology, this salvaged tech, resulted in a very vibrant civilization in which kids were taught how to repurpose technology. Kids were taught how to make stuff. Kids were taught how to use culture and education in order to advance their own survival. And so the first class began with that what if. And then each one of us created a character, and then we started telling stories about what a day in their life would be like. And as we did so, we came up with different ideas. So, like, I might think, what, my character is going to, wake up in the morning and go out to their solar collector, and through the use of, collecting, energy purely from solar cells, that's how they heat up their water to make their coffee in the morning. It's not much of a stretch, right? Somebody else might say, okay, so my character wakes up in the morning and they make their coffee through a system that basically generates energy by separating the salt out of the water beneath them, or separates out the organic matter in the Lagos Lagoon water, and then by separating that out of the water, both purifies the water and creates a sort of a burnable sludge that can then be combusted for energy. And what we would do in each class is kind of go around and say, that's a really neat idea, I'm going to take that. And so we would write it up into this is the set of stuff that exists, right? This sort of collective encyclopedia. And then we would build on that, right? So what if then, what then, what then, what then, what then, what? And as a collective, we would start feeling out the borders of this world. We would start, building out the details that would pertain or that would emerge, from that kind of collective imagination. And so then we would start to plot these stories over top of each other. So what you see in this slide is basically a timeline, right? So the light blue color shows that this is Noah, the character down here in the lower left, and this is how Noah goes about his day. In this one, my character, Michael Monaji, who's a graphic novelist, has a much smaller stomping grounds inside of the city, but this is how he goes about his day. This is where he gets his breakfast. This is where he makes his art. This is, how he teaches other students how to make, future sci-fi comic books inside of this sort of a world. Other characters, Cordelia here, I think was a musician and a cultural leader, so she might travel further around the place. Tehumola, if I remember right, was a virtual reality drug dealer. And so he had this one particular place that he would, come in and set up shop in this sort of virtual reality opium den, kind of a place. And then Rashida Akili, I think, was a religious leader, right? And so this is where she would, go around and do her mission work inside of the city. And Williams Sangoridin, Sangodaran was an educator. Right, so he was both a technologist and the kind of guy that would salvage, the technology and bring it back and teach students how to use it. And so some of these places where you see him moving inside of the space are like under the bridge up there, where he might collect technology that has been cast off by travelers and sunk down into the lagoon. So when you start to overlap all these stories on top of each other, particular hot spots begin to emerge. So you can sort of see up in the upper left here, and not hard upper left where William goes off on the fringes, but where there's that cluster of green and red and blue dots, that might be a sort of town square, right? So as you start to see these places where these characters might overlap in their daily lives, those become story generators in their own right, right? So places like bars, hospitals, schools, all these kinds of places can turn into generators of multiple stories, right? So, that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at World as a main character is by the kind of rough, quick, dirty prototyping models you can start to do. So, Frank Espinoza was or he is, but he was. Dude's still alive. Long story short, dude's still alive. He was the guy that Warner Brothers brought in to redesign the Looney Tunes when they did Space Jam, back in the 90s. So he has this long, illustrious history of work in Hollywood and animation. But one of my favorite works of his is this series of graphic novels called Raquetto, which is very clearly inspired by kind of classic French bande dessinée comics like Tintin, those sort of Belgian adventure comics. But what he taught us, so he was a visiting assistant professor at MIT. Please ignore Siri. Um, so what Frank did was he came into MIT and he taught us some of his best practices for world building. And so um, what he would do is take this big, like a big dry erase marker and a big crystal clear whiteboard, and he would just scribble on the board, like make one big swooping squiggle, and then make another big swooping squiggle, and then draw in a couple of carrots, in one place, and a couple of wavy lines in another. And he's like, okay, this is one continent, this is another continent, this is a desert, this is an ocean. What do you observe about where the interactions are going to be? Right? So, how are the different civilizations going to emerge that would live in a desert versus civilizations that would live in the ocean? And what would each group have to trade? What particular parts of the world would generate conflict because there's only so much stuff in this particular place? Is there a narrow spot, sort of an isthmus, that would barricade ships, or they could be barricaded in order to prevent ships from passing through, so that somebody might construct these gates either as a line of security and defense or as a way to claim tariffs by people that are passing by, right? So what kinds of emergent storytelling, conflicts, cultures, civilizations, all that kind of stuff emerge just when you start looking at these squiggles on a whiteboard, right? And it's that kind of map-centric storytelling that helps you start to imagine the storytelling opportunities that emerge just from simple terrain, right? So when you start looking at worlds like Game of Thrones, then you start seeing like, just watch the opening credits for Game of Thrones sometime. You'll see these civilizations emerge that have different philosophies about what it means to how they're going to get their food, or what it means to be a good person, right? The House Greyjoy, the sailors in that world, their motto is "We do not sow," right? And their house mascot is this squid, and they are a completely seafaring people, and that means that they are able to trade a bunch of stuff, and it also means that they are incredibly well skilled at waging naval warfare, right? But it also means that they don't have any land of their own to protect, and they don't have any land of their own that they can farm. So what does that mean for their culture, especially contrasted against something like, House Targaryen, or the Starks, in the frozen north? Just the culture alone of, living in a frozen world like the Starks do up along the wall in the north of the kingdoms. That's going to do stuff to your general overall culture. It's going to do stuff to your general hardiness, what it is that you view as being a good person, what it means that, or how you view, the rest of the world as a result of that. Do you view the rest of the world as somebody that's there to kill you? Do you view the rest of the world as somebody that owes you fealty? Do you view the rest of the world as somebody that you're there to serve? Do you view the rest of the world as a bunch of targets for your cons, right? All that kind of stuff is very clearly related. So my other favorite part of maps is gets back to something that we're going to talk about a lot, which is this idea of negative capability. And so negative capability is it's the human imagine it's the capacity of the human imagination to fill in a gap in a story, right? So if I make a reference to something and I haven't explained it yet, if it's too big, then it can cause that story to come to a screeching halt. If it's a small and elegantly done, mention of something, external, some person, place, or thing that has not yet been brought up in the story, then it kind of opens up this kind of empty space in the canvas, right? And so, just like negative space in paintings, the human imagination can fill in that gap with something that basically serves as a placeholder until the storyteller themselves can come in and fill it in. And so on maps, my favorite feature is where you see these things that say, "Here be dragons." Right? It's those areas of the map that are mysterious. It's those unexplored territories, or those places that maybe we've been once, but we've forgotten about them. Who was it that went in and never came back? What are those things? What are those dragons there that are monsters? That do we make them up? Are they genuine monsters? They're keeping us from going in there. Are they fake monsters that somebody else dreamed up to keep us from going in there? Kind of like the way that classic fairy tales of giant wolves in the woods existed in order to keep little kids from wandering off into the woods, right? What is it that's in those weird empty spaces in the maps? And so as you start to sketch out your worlds, don't make them too full, right? Always be sure to include some kind of empty spaces, and that goes for both maps and timelines. So the other way of thinking about building a world is by building the timelines associated with that world. So those big key events, right? I'm not talking about just the lifetime of your hero. I'm talking about what are the big, huge wars? What are the big, huge invention moments? What is the equivalent of the Industrial Revolution in your story? What is the moment that is the point where this particular religion split off? Luther nailing up the theses on the door, right? Where does Protestantism split off from Catholicism, and how does that serve as a story engine? Right? So if you're starting to think through deviations from reality and reactions to those deviations, then you might start to say things like, well, this particular geographic deviation from reality. So there's this giant volcano rises up in the middle of Mexico, and suddenly all that it transforms the way that the Northern American continent actually looks. What does that mean? Does that mean that there's this sudden part of the continent that is thrown into shadow, or is there a ash cloud that is now lingering over this part of Mexico, and it, for whatever reason, won't move? Does that mean that there's now this dark part of Mexico and nobody knows, what's in there? What is the first group of people that came out of the cloud? What do they look like? Are they, are they stained with soot? Are they burned with lava? Are they turned white as ash for some strange reason? Like, what does that look like, right? So, it's those kinds of, what if moments from that central deviation from reality that might go both geographically, culturally, and chronologically that are going to start filling out your worlds and make them feel more robust, right? So, that's the basic upshot of this. What I want you to do for your as you start to move through this set of exercises is to think through what your central deviation from reality is, and then how that's going to affect all these different levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you find that your deviation from reality, let me go back to the hierarchy. If you find that your here we go. If you find that your deviation from reality is really only impacting like the top couple levels in the hierarchy of needs, you haven't built a world. You built a neat story, maybe, but not a world. So I want you to think through that. I want you to think through that carefully. I want you to think through the kind of the maps. Your maps don't have to be terribly detailed. Just a couple squiggles on a sheet of paper for now. And as your story world evolves, then you're going to start filling in details of like cities and oceans. And as you think through these sort of adventures, you can start adding those details to the overall thing, right? So one way to do that that's relatively easy to hack, comparatively easy to hack, is to do it in something like Google Slides, right? To make some collaborative document that is basically one big sketchbook that you all can start scribbling in together. Another way to do it is by collecting more of the images for the Pinterest boards, right? So if you're creating what's called a mood board that captures what you want your world to look like and to feel like, that's a great way of doing it. So create one shared Pinterest board that all of y'all can add images to, and then use that as a way to kind of quickly refine the sort of aesthetic of your world, the kind of cultures of your world. And you can add notes on each thing to say, well, this is what my house Targaryen looks like. This is what my house Lancaster looks like. This is what my house Stark looks like inside of this world. These are those different cultures, and this is how those react to your central deviations from reality. Okay, so thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.